Good evening, folks. This is Founder Layroon with Fantasy Grounds College, and I'm going to do a show that will cover some of the basics that you get with Fantasy Grounds when you first get started. A lot of confusion, or people don't quite understand what this stuff is, so I'm going to go over it, and even if you do understand, this might be a refresher. So basically, when you first start playing online, there's a lot of things that you have to consider, including how you're going to communicate and which platform to use. Obviously, I'm more biased. I have a community that's centered around Fantasy Grounds. There are other really good virtual tabletops out there. I'm going to mainly focus on what's good about Fantasy Grounds, but at the end, I'll show a few comparisons. This is not a comparison video or who has the bigger sword video. This is basically about Fantasy Grounds. Although at the very end, when we get to the Players Handbook, I will discuss a little bit of that. So first things first, when you have a demo account, you're going to get the SRD, which is a system reference document. And this is something that you'll get whether you have a license or not. What this does is it allows you to look at some of the rules and some of the content without actually purchasing a book. And in the library, and then if you go to modules, you can load the SRD from here. So I'm going to type SRD to search. And I'm in the data module activation area. So here I have this SRD stuff loaded, which is the system reference documents. This stuff is free online if you don't want the digital copy or if you want both. So if you go to the links, you can go to the actual website, and then there's a direct download for the PDF for the SRD. And if you have Fantasy Grounds, if you click in the reference manual in the library itself, so if you go to the data and the reference manual, you will get the reference manual that's in the Fantasy Grounds format, and this is the actual text that comes out of the PDF. So you have the open game license, gives you a rough idea of how characters are built, tells you a little bit about playing the game, somewhat, and then it actually goes into some rules and some references, and at the very end are some appendices. So this is what you're getting with the basic rules. It's really not a lot of content to build with, but it gives you a rough start. There are some significant differences between the SRD, the basic rules, and the Fantasy Grounds version of the Players Handbook. So I'm going to go over some of those differences, and you'll be able to tell because I have in the library, I have the SRD loaded, the basic rules, and the Players Handbook. So I can just go through a few of those, and I'll show you what the differences are. But the SRD was really published for the open game license. It really gives you a place to understand what the original game license is. It gives you an idea of what you can publish and that sort of thing. So there's a table on the website that I made a copy of, basically, that just the activities are things that you want to do, and then here are what's covered. So mainly, if you want to do anything with Fantasy Grounds, outside of the Fantasy Grounds store, you're probably going to want to do the DM's Guild. However, if you are a third-party or second-party publisher and you use the OGL, which is the original game license, that means you're not using any of the official 5th edition settings or content. You're making up your own stuff. That would be like Kobold Press and those kinds of publishers. They have their own worlds. They have their own content. But the base and the basic underlying thing is that they are using the OGL. So in other words, they're not using the Forgotten Realms. They're not using the main names like the Faerun and the Menzoberranzan. They're not using the settings and that sort of thing. They have their own settings, their own worlds, basically. So their work is kind of piled on top of the SRD. And then they just interpret that their own way. And then when they publish, they're covered under the OGL license. So the SRD was designed more for developers and content creators. Although you can build some characters with the SRD, you're just very limited. You only have like one background, things like that. You only have like the race in Maybe you'll have the basic races. So that's what the limitations are. So if you, let's say, for instance, if you wanted to go to classes, like if you wanted to look up, what classes are available. In the SRD, all the basic classes are covered. The only thing is, if you pull up, like, let's say, the cleric, and you scroll down to the subclasses or the archetypes, you only have the life domain to work with when you have only the SRD loaded. Now, if you go to the basic rules for the players, you have even less character options. However, I think you have one more. Let's see. Let's go to the... Nope, you still only have the life domain. So you're limited on domains as far as what you can pick for your class. But if you have the Players Handbook and you pull up the cleric, now you're getting a bunch of other content. So you're getting all the domains. So that's the difference between the three, or at least one of the differences is that you're limited on content. So you have basically just the basic or raw parts of the rule books. You're missing a lot of the artwork. You may not have all the options that you want. So the SRD is more or less a foundation of what everything is built upon. And apparently they have a way to license content through the DM's Guild if you're going to create content that's centered around the Forgotten Realms or the current settings that are out. So you're allowed to do that in the DM's Guild, but nowhere else. However, like I said, if you're Frog God Games or Wizards of the Coast subsidiaries, like I wouldn't say subsidiaries, but second-party publishers like Cobalt Press and those sort of individuals, or those teams, they're pretty much licensed to use with the OGL, so they have their content. So basically, they want to design their own content with the 5th edition rules. That's allowed. They want to publish their own content using the 5th edition rules. And they want to print and sell. So those are covered under OGL. Everything else has to be done through the DM's Guild. So the DM's Guild allows everything except for printing and selling the D&D product on your own. So you have to go through the DM's Guild. But everything else is covered. So it looks like if you want to publish something for yourself as your own person or your own individual, the OGL is the way to go if you're going to make your own special world or content. However, if you want to borrow concepts and build upon what's already out there, you want to use the DM's Guild. The SRD has been updated occasionally. They've added more stuff to it. That's because there are new things that are introduced as more rule books come out. So it's been updated. I think the last time they updated it was, the 2016. But the updates included some things in chapters that weren't there, and they reorganized the SRD. So if you go to the basic information, in the basic rules, it gives you more of the lore and the background and the content. So this is almost like an intermediate way of having the content, except for you're limited on classes, as we saw earlier, and backgrounds and such. But the basic rules divided into 4 parts. Part 1 is about creating characters and such, which you won't have as many options, but there are some stuff. And it says many of the rules in Part 1 rely on material in Parts 2 and 3, so you have to remember that. Then there's the actual rules on how to play the game. So this content would be, the basic rules would be great for new players or people new to Dungeons & Dragons. The SRD is good for people that kind of understand it already but want to publish and build content and such. But the basic rules are just mainly for new people that are new to all the main concepts of the game. And Part 3 covers magic, for spell casting and magic items and monsters and stuff that use magic. And then Part 4 is basically DM information. So it's information about stat blocks for monsters, building encounters, magic items, that sort of thing. So you can download the basic rules and the SRD for free on the Wizards of the Coast website. Or if you have a basic license or a demo license of Fantasy Grounds, if you go into the library and go into modules, you can look for those and search for them and load them. Once they're loaded, you can read through them through the reference manual. So I have them linked here, but they're in the books here. So if you clicked on, let's say, the basic rules for the Players Handbook, the reference manual is there. So the reference manual for the Players Handbook looks like this. And then you can just go down here and read off this information. And like I said, you can go to the website and download the PDF version. But this is all that information put into Fantasy Grounds format, and this is the reference manual, is the actual book. Now when you get to the Player's Handbook, this is where things get different. So if you only have a demo license, you won't have access to the store. So in order to have access to the Fantasy Grounds store to actually buy content that's created already, you will need to have a account on Fantasy Grounds, which is their forums. And when you download the demo, you're going to put in your password and your name in the settings of Fantasy Grounds. So if you are using Fantasy Grounds, in which I'll do that shortly, and you want to bring up or look at something that is in the basic rules, you can do that. So I'm going to go and bring up Fantasy Grounds right now and take you through that. So I'm going to go I'm in the actual program right now, but I'm going to go into the launcher so that you guys can see what I'm talking about. All right. So basically, I'm going to go ahead and turn that on. So this is the launcher for Fantasy Grounds. Once you're to this point and you've installed, you might get a check for updates button on the bottom left, depending if you own any content or maybe you've just got a license. So basically, once you have installed it, this is the launcher. I would check for updates initially, and once you do that, it'll go through the motions and it'll pull in anything that's been changed or revised. Then I would go into your settings. And when you're in your settings, you're basically going to change or put in whatever it is that you need to for your name and your license. So sorry about the distortion. It's trying to basically stretch this across the screen. So when you're trying to, when you get a license key, if you buy one, you would put it in here. And then your username and your password for the online Fantasy Grounds website goes in here. And you click on login, and then you hit save, and that will basically make Fantasy Grounds restart. And then you'll hit update again, and it will pull in all your products that you've purchased or your license or whatever. And then it will actually go back into the launch screen. At this point, you'll be able to create a campaign or a session, and then you'll be able to start off. So I have a new thing that I created for the 5th edition rule set. So I'm going to pick the 5e rule set. And then anytime you have something that's already created, you would just go ahead and load it. So this one's already been loaded. So here's the D&D SRD. I already created that content. And I'm going to go ahead and hit start. And it's going to take me into my notes and all of my different pieces of Fantasy Grounds that I have loaded. So while that's loading, I did some research on pricing and other things, so I'll go over that a little bit. But basically, when you break it down really fine and you look at all the different platforms and how all different things come together, it's really kind of a wash. Basically, the prices come down to dollars. It's not like hundreds of dollars. It's basically dollars. And then convenience. And then the other thing is, can you play offline or online? Those sort of things. So just hands down, just having the ability to work offline without needing the internet is my biggest selling point for Fantasy Grounds. So I don't need to have Fantasy Grounds connected to the internet if I just want to play around on my desktop. And I don't need to have anyone connected, and I'm just working on my campaigns or designing stuff. That's great because I have access to everything on my computer. I don't have to log into a website necessarily, and I don't have to be connected to anybody. But if you're going to use a lot of the other services, you're either going to have to come up with some special way to host it, or you're going to have to be online. And if you're out camping somewhere and you have a laptop and 3 batteries, you don't need the internet. You just have some backup batteries. You print off your character sheets, and you use Fantasy Grounds like you would your library. So instead of lugging around a suitcase, you will have your library. So this is the Fantasy Grounds interface. I mentioned earlier that if you go to the library and then you look at all these different rules that I have loaded, you go into modules, and that's where you load any content that you own or that comes with Fantasy Grounds. So if you type SRD down here, it'll show that content, and then you just click the load button. So right now I already have that loaded. I have the basic rules loaded, and then I have the Players Handbook loaded. So those are your different options for Fantasy Grounds. As a player, you don't really need a whole lot. If your game master is running everything, all you need is the demo. If you want to create characters and you want to do a little bit of your own stuff on your own without your game master, then you'll have to get at least a standard license. If you want to make your own worlds and run your own games and get a lot more out of it, then you're going to get a ultimate license. And in that case, you can host anybody. You can host demo licenses or standard licenses. If you're a standard user, you can only host other people that have licenses, not demos. So that's the difference between the two. The other thing is having the ability to host others without restriction is probably the main feature that Ultimate has. And you're basically looking at $150 for the lifetime license. So if Fantasy Grounds updates or anything like that, you're not paying any upgrade fees. The content still costs. So that's true of any rule set. When you buy the base core system, which is the interface, you have to buy content. There's really no way around it. Unless you understand how the system works or how Fantasy Grounds works, then you can hand enter all your rules if you want to. I'm just saying that it can be done. It's just very time consuming. A lot of people complain, well, I don't want Fantasy Grounds now because I already own the books and I already have D&D Beyond. So the books and D&D Beyond and Fantasy Grounds is quite an expendy thing. You're looking at over $1,000. But when you actually break things down and you look at convenience and what's what, really, I think Fantasy Grounds has a little bit of an edge, and that's probably just because I'm a user of it and I have the community. But looking at it from kind of a customer endpoint standpoint, it really is a close call. So I have some basic characters that I have set here that aren't filled out yet. And then here's the character wizard, which allows you to build your own characters provided you have content. And if you don't, you're very limited as to what you can make. So if you only have the SRD, you can only really build one type of character. And that's kind of true of the basic rules as well. So you're kind of stuck. So you have the basic rules. You have the SRD, which comes with the demo. And then the Player's Handbook would be like if you had a standard license and you got the Player's Handbook. Now, if you have the SRD loaded and the basic rules and you understand how Fantasy Grounds works, you could actually copy and paste from D&D Beyond your rule set books or your settings, but it just is a ton of work. And if you have the hardback books, it's even harder because you have to retype everything. I like Fantasy Grounds because it's already self-contained. You don't have to do much of else. Some of the locations where things are at, or some of the things don't make sense for the UI. So like the other competitors to Fantasy Grounds have some advantages on a more modern user interface that makes a lot more sense. However, they lack a lot of the power or the basically the computations that Fantasy Grounds has matured into. So Fantasy Grounds is not one of those things where you're going to get instant satisfaction. A lot of people didn't even make it to the release of the new Fantasy Grounds Unity. They even went as far as investing, a couple $100, and by the time Unity came out, they were so frustrated that they moved on to something else. Or they weren't patient enough to stick around to see the direction it's going in, because from the time the beta came out till now, the Unity has actually come a long ways. It still has some work to be done on it, but it's way better. We're on the cusp of getting the dynamic lighting. They're just squashing out some bugs and performance issues. We're on the verge of getting an online store. I think by the end of this year, we'll have some sort of announcement probably that they're going to work on releasing some kind of content store so that people can create content and sell it and distribute it or make it free and easier to pull into Fantasy Grounds. So that way, for updates and such, it'll be a lot easier. So there's going to be support for third-party developers like us, like ourselves. And this also gives Fantasy Grounds a little bit more flexibility and getting their share of whatever it is that they need for their percentage. So the other thing is, you could publish stuff on the DMs Guild, but that's all a manual process. So you have to upload it on the DMs Guild, you have to list it, you have to maintain it, and then people have to go to the website to pay for the items. But if Fantasy Grounds makes a built-in store, a storefront, I think it'll be a lot easier. So you can just go there and then update Fantasy Grounds, and it'll pull in your purchases. So that may help a little bit. But nonetheless, you have different options for the basic, the demo. You have the SRD, which I was explaining earlier, is a system reference document that has the original game license, and it's mainly for developers and content creators. It tells you what you can and can't do. There's a PDF that you can download, and there's also the reference manual in Fantasy Grounds. So you have that even with the demo. Also, the basic rules, same thing. You can get the basic rules off the Wizards of the Coast website. The PDF is free. You have the players section and the DM section in regards to the reference manuals for the basic rules. It's just very limited. So those are what you get when you actually just have the base core demo. Once you step up to a license, and if you buy the PHB, you're going to have a reference manual with the full book. So you'll have, not only will you have all the Fantasy Grounds stuff, but you'll have the actual book, and you go through it just like you would a regular textbook, and you got these buttons that you can pass forward, you can bookmark. So if you wanted to look at this beyond first level later, you can take this link and drag and drop it into the hotkeys. So there's some features in Fantasy Grounds that I really like. That's one of them. And then you have a search field. So if you wanted to look up languages, there's a spot about languages, and then you can just drag and drop that down to the hotkeys, and you close the reference manual, and then you can pop up the reference sheet that you made a shortcut of. So that's pretty handy and quicker to use than some of the other content. So there's a reference manual that's built into the Players Handbook if you buy it from the Fantasy Grounds store. If you build your own Players Handbook, you're probably not going to have a reference manual unless you use a third-party extension. And then you have to learn how to use that too. So I did a little digging around. So if you were going to buy just the hardcover, right now on Amazon, at least for the US dollar, the last thing I looked at was $31.50 for the hardcover for a brand new. If you didn't mind a used copy or a gently used one, it's $22.50, which isn't too bad, but it's probably got a little bit of wear in it. I went to D&D Beyond. If you have an account there and you wanted to buy this content, it's $29.99. But you're stuck with the web only. So if you don't have internet, you're not getting on the D&D Beyond. It's online only. And if you get in and you get all the content and there's a new book coming out, they quite often will have a sale, like a pre-sale. So does Amazon, where you can get this for probably $25. It just depends. The Steam version of Fantasy Grounds is $29.99, or it's based on your local economy. So if you don't live in the United States, getting it through Steam might be a boon for you. Unless you're in Europe somewhere, maybe the pound or the euro is more expensive, so you might want to buy it directly from the store. But if you're from another country where the dollar is worth less than the US, this would be better than going through the direct store in most cases. If you go for a bundle or you already have a bunch of content, you'll get minus 15% for the bundled pricing. So in other words, if there's 8 books in this bundle and they add another book to that bundle price, when you buy the next book, it's going to be minus 15% off. What usually ends up happening is you end up getting a book or two for free if you buy the bundle. What I like about the Steam and Fantasy Grounds is that you can use Fantasy Grounds offline. So that's the biggest selling point for me, is if you can't get online and get to your books, then I don't know. I don't really like that idea. So Fantasy Grounds Direct Store, same thing, $29.99, minus 15% for bundled pricing. So there's a few different bundles. There's a completionist, there's the essentials, there's other rule sets that have bundles. You usually get 10 or 15% off depending on what it is. And that's a pretty good deal. So if you own a lot of the content and you buy the last couple books that you don't own, you're going to get that discount. And if they add anything to that bundle, anything under that umbrella is going to be 15% off. And then sometimes there's sales that come up around different times of the year. And sometimes those, or usually those sales stack. So if it's 10% off for that sale and you already have 15% off, sometimes that percentage will stack, or you'll get the favorable of the two. It depends on what the content is and what the licensing agreement is. I looked at Roll20, $29.99. It's digital only, so if you have access to the internet, that's great. I'm not saying that Fantasy Grounds is any better than Roll20, but I think it has crept up and become a little bit better anyways. And then I looked at Astral and Foundry. Basically, you're going to pay $120 for both. And that's going to be basically based on a few things. So I looked at Astral. So Astral has a couple different subscription fees, and so does Fantasy Grounds, by the way. So if you can't afford the $150 up front, you can always nickel and dime yourself till the end of the year. But ultimately, it's cheaper just to buy it in one shot. So the way they do Astral is very similar. It's $120 per year, but that's for the top tier. That's not. There's a gold and a platinum. So it's $60 for, basically for 6 months or whatever, and then for a year it's $120. Foundry is similar. You get $50 to buy in, but if you want to use any D&D Beyond content or anything that's official, neither of those rule sets have anything that's official. You have to basically put it in yourself. And then if you do, you're going to be scraping off of D&D Beyond. So if you add the cost of being a member and owning content on D&D Beyond, I don't see where the savings is, because you have $50 to just own it, which is a lifetime. But then you have fees if you want to use the scraping tool that allows you to bring in content from D&D Beyond. So if it's an extension or some kind of add-on, you're going to pay anywhere from $2 to $5 per month from a Patreon fee. So if you do the math on that, that's another $60. So it's $110 for the first year. So it's not that much different than Fantasy Grounds. And on top of that, Fantasy Grounds, if you do buy the Ultimate Edition and not the subscription, you're not going to get nickeled and dimed. It's all one thing, you're done. You don't ever have to pay for that base license again. And that's the same for Astral and Foundry, but they don't have any official content yet. So you have to rely on a third-party tool to pull in that content. And it's not a lifetime guarantee either. So if you're using their tool to pull in content, you're basically scraping from the D&D Beyond account. And the D&D Beyond account is something that's up to you if you want it to be, if you want to have the content or not. So this might be an option for you if you already have the D&D Beyond account. Then you might want to switch to Foundry or Astral or whatever. But if you don't have anything yet, I wouldn't go that route. It's kind of a very roundabout gray area that you have to go through. I'm sure it works pretty good. I'm not questioning that. I'm just questioning the fact that it's not officially licensed content. So it's kind of a gray area. And it also relies on the fact that you have online access. So what if your computer goes down, or you don't have or I don't mean your computer, but your network goes down? Then you no longer have access to anything. And even if you host one of these on a Amazon server or your local server, you still have to connect to scrape the content. So I don't know if I like that or not. So that would be the difference. And also, honestly, this is my opinion. You don't have to agree with me. But I really think that this kind of model of doing business, it's cheaper for the entry level or for people that already have D&D Beyond, but it's really no advantage over Fantasy Grounds, to be honest, because you're paying for D&D Beyond and maybe even their subscription or whatever content you have, plus you're paying for that, and you're paying the monthly scraping tool, unless you've made your own. So that right there is way too much drama and way too many points of failure. So I'm not really I don't think that's a good idea for a new player. Maybe someone that already has content, but even then, you're still going through hoops. The thing that I don't like is that without a contained system like Roll20 or this Fantasy Grounds, is that I think it encourages more bootleg content. So like Astral, you can load PDFs and such in there. And I don't know, and I don't think that D&D, other than the basic rules and such, have PDFs. So that would be a red flag that if someone has a PDF of the rulebook, it's more than likely not official. I'm talking about the actual Players Handbook, not the SRD and the basic rules. The other thing is a lot of the content that comes from Paizo and such are in PDF format. So that's really a lot easier to distribute. And I think what this encourages is people taking content or borrowing content or sharing it with their friends and not paying for it, which I can understand if you don't have the money, but it's not legal, and it also just doesn't help anybody in the long run. So if you're taking content online, you're probably getting subpar quality. So a lot of the bootleg stuff out there is probably just photos or scans, or even if it's content, it's somebody else's content. So I don't know if I like the Astral or Foundry option because of that reason. This is just a personal opinion. I could be wrong about this, but I think it really would encourage more people to use bootleg content. And that's because they don't have the subscription to D&D Beyond, or they can't afford it. Maybe they can afford the $50 and the $5 a month, but maybe there's content they don't have, so they're going to look elsewhere to find it. So I don't know. I'm not saying that doesn't happen with the other platforms, because I'm sure there's people using bootleg tokens and whatnot, but there's a lot less of it. And I think the lesser of the evils is better all around for the publisher. So if you're a publisher or someone that makes content, these other platforms may or may not be good for you as far as business goes. So Roll20 and Fantasy Grounds kind of have their own self-contained options. D&D Beyond is self-contained, but being that it gets scraped from Foundry, I don't know how that works, but it's not official. I haven't seen any problems with it yet, but hopefully they'll allow it. But they either need to buy them guys out or cancel it altogether, because that's a really weird way to run business. And this is featured on the website. This isn't some second party or some weird guy that's doing it. They actually advertise that tool and the subscription of it on their website. So it's not like it's a total bootleg guy, but the usage of it might be a gray area as far as utilizing the content off the D&D Beyond website. I don't know if it goes against their terms of services or what, but anyways, I don't like the idea that it could be bootlegged or promote additional piracy above and beyond what's already out there. And the only thing I can think of that might be a little better is that the user interface is probably nicer from what I saw. And customizing and using your assets like that you already have might be easier. This Fantasy Grounds takes a little understanding to make your content turn out correctly. But there again, it's all online use only for those tools. So I don't know. I want the option of having a program that doesn't rely totally on the internet. I must be old, but I don't have very many times where my network isn't working, but the times it has worked, it really sucks. You can't do anything. So having that ability to play without needing that is great. So that's some of the differences that I had. Let's see. It's meant to be a legal way for third parties to make. There is a license you agree to. Yes. So the system reference documents is free rules, kind of limited without trademarks. Yes. So yes, there are downsides to loading both. Yeah. So SRD basic rules are a lot of it's redundant material. You'll see that. Let's see if I bring out the classes here. Let's see. So right now I have all the things showing in the classes, but if I filter this to SRD data, I have all of the basic classes. But if I only have the basic rules, I only have the 4 main classes. And then both of those do not have all of the options like the Player's Handbook. So then if you go up to, like, let's say races, for instance, if you wanted to pick a race for your character, if you only have the SRD, these are you have some of the basics and some of the additional ones. But then when you go to the basic rules, there's only like 4 or 5 different, or 4 races. And then when you go to the Player's Handbook, you have more variations. So the SRD has more content, but it has less artwork, less lore, less rules, like explanations. It's more like just having the rules, and you have to adapt it yourself. So the SRD is better for OGL license holders. The basic rules is good for people that want to read how the rules play. I would say this is more geared for players. The SRD is more geared for developers and content creators. When you actually buy the Player's Handbook, you're getting all that stuff and more, plus the artwork and all the indexes and they all have a reference manual, but the Player's Handbook is the basis. So if you can't afford all those books, at least if you get a license, at least get the Player's Handbook. Everything from there would be gravy. You don't have to have all the other books. But if you own like some of this other content and you use it in other formats, it may or may not be accessible to you if your network goes down. So that's the only thing I can argue in favor of Fantasy Grounds, is that you have access to your content whether you're online or not. And you can take a laptop up camping or to some place that doesn't have wireless internet or plugged-in internet, and you can just grab a couple extra batteries and use that as your library. So you have different options for the basic stuff. So if you are just going to play casually every now and again, just get the demo. If you want to build characters and make your own stuff with Fantasy Grounds, even though you're not a game master, get the Player's Handbook and a basic license. If you are a game master or a content creator or somebody that plays a lot, it'd probably behoove you to get an ultimate license, which is $150. It does go on sale like every quarter. So generally there's some kind of sale going on. So if you don't want to pay $150, you can usually get around paying like $140 or something like that. But nonetheless, when you're using Fantasy Grounds, it's all self-contained. And that's kind of what makes it harder for people to create content for it. But it also keeps away a lot of the riffraff, the people sharing stuff and bootlegging and that sort of thing. It kind of cuts back on that a little. But I'm not saying it doesn't happen. It's just less likely. The other stuff like Astral and Foundry, I think that sort of business model is good for, like a player who already has the content and wants another solution. That may be something, but for somebody brand new to the whole thing, I don't think that's the way to go. Price-wise, yeah, maybe. But as far as content and legalness and all that good stuff, no. For Roll20 is okay, but I don't like that it's online. That's probably my biggest complaint. Fantasy Grounds, like I said, is good because you can use it offline or online. And if you are outside of the US, you get better pricing on Steam, so that's something to keep in mind. There's always sales on Fantasy Grounds content, so every week they put out a new product, and then they'll have a sales item. So quite often, you want to piece together your collection, just do that. just wait every week. There's usually one book on sale. And then the D&D Beyond is a wholly contained service. It can be used effectively around the table or online, but I don't like the idea that it doesn't have really a digital map space so much, and that's why people integrate it with Foundry, because you have that visual component to it and some of the automation. The Amazon hardback book is $31.50 for a new one, and 20 something for a used copy. So, you do the math. Fantasy Grounds, you pay for I think for $200. Honestly, you can have the license and one or two of the core books. If you pay for Roll20, kind of the same thing, except for it's online only. If you pay, Astral and Foundry and those, you pay $110, $120, but you have no additional content unless you rent or subscribe to their scraping tool, which is a lifetime license plus $60 a year. I think they nickel and dime you. It's like $5 a month to use that tool. So I don't know. I really don't think that that's the way to go overall. I think maybe if you're frustrated with Fantasy Grounds and you're not patient enough to wait for the features to get refined, or you don't understand how to use Fantasy Grounds as a developer, then those might be options for you. It might be a little easier to put content together in the other platforms, but it's certainly not any more stable or accessible. So if you don't have internet, you're not going to be working on your campaign or playing any games. That's all there is to it. I'm sure there's ways around that, but then you have to be a network engineer or somebody that understands how to host things on an Amazon server, or you have to hook up your home network a certain way. I don't know. I don't think that's any better than Fantasy Grounds. It's just a few dollars we're talking difference. And with Fantasy Grounds, you're getting officially licensed content. On top of that, as far as community goes, I think Fantasy Grounds has a really decent community. I would give it a B+. I don't know about the D&D Beyond community, and I don't know about the Amazon community, but I know the Roll20 community has been up and down quite a bit, and I don't know about the others, but I know that Fantasy Grounds has a really good community, so I'm pretty happy with that. But other than that, those are the differences between the different types and formats and what you might and might not do. So it depends on Amazon. Yep, I hope they get Star Trek going too. Yep, so that's just basically the sort of things that you can expect from those types of things and platforms. Now, when you build a character with either of those books, it's going to give you a similar experience. The only way to truly be able to tell is to only have one of the rule sets loaded. I have all three. So I have the Players Handbook, I have the basic DM and Player's Guide, and then I have the 3 SRD books. So if I go into modules and then I shut off some of these, so if I click the load filter, this only shows what I have loaded. So if you take off the basic rules and the Player's Handbook, that's your SRD. Now, if you only have the Player's Handbook and you don't have any of their content, you can get rid of the SRD and keep the bestiary, because that's a monster manual basically, and then you keep the SRD magic items. So that'll expand upon what you have in your Player's Handbook. It'll give you some more monsters, the basic ones without the art, and then you're going to get some magic items. So that's not a bad combo right here, is to have the Player's Handbook loaded, and then the SRD bestiary, which is your monster manual, just pared down, and then you'll have some magic items. So that's not a bad thing right there. That's a pretty good, if you're a player, that's pretty much all you need. You can use the bestiary to practice fighting monsters and such. You can build characters, provided you have a basic license, and then you can alter or edit characters that you have already. When you have just a demo, you don't really have the ability to save any of that data, and even if you do, you don't have any material to pull upon. So the only time you can work on your characters if you only have the demo is if your game master leaves their table open, or if you have your own license. You can create your own rule books. It just takes a long time. So basically, you have your basic character. You can have an SRD character or a full Players Handbook character. They'll all work similarly. You just have way less options. So the SRD has some options. The basic rules have some options that are different. And the Players Handbook has all of them. So these are your free content. And then this would be more or less if you're connected to another table or if you have your own Players Handbook. And that would be the basics there. If you have just the Players Handbook and the SRD loaded, I think this is a really good happy medium here. And this eliminates having to get the Dungeon Master's Guide and the Monster Manual if you're just a player. So that is just basically the way it goes. There was a how to build Pathfinder 2 characters on the college a couple months ago. Yep, that's right. That is absolutely right. Been trying to create characters. Hubby plans to run Pathfinder. So depending on if it's Pathfinder 1 or 2, it's very similar to the D&D stuff, except for there might be a little bit different order of things. A lot of it's drag and drop. Pathfinder 2 has a built-in wizard that kind of helps you build your characters, but it is still nice to see something. There are official rule content. Yeah, I looked at the cleric one. Problem is the bard is a bit different. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, so that's more about understanding the rules more than actually Fantasy Grounds. So that the college, we more focused on the actual interface than the rules themselves. Although character creation is rule set specific, so that comes with it. Yeah, Pathfinder 2. Yep. I'm sure it is a little different. We have some modules that we have in the community that are all Pathfinder 2. So if you can ask for those, it's a bundle that I put together that has some third-party modules that were created free, and you can find them on the official Fantasy Grounds forums, but they're kind of scattered. So I picked them all up and put them in a pile, basically. And it's basically a lot of the automation that people look for or some common things that they need. But there's also a curriculum in there for building characters, so it might help you because we have some previous instructors that have left behind some pretty good tutorials. So if you're interested in that content, just ask around in the Fantasy Grounds College community. And we did do a video, so if you want to go to YouTube, there is a playlist for Pathfinder 2 that I did with a guy named Sedain. And we did 2 episodes where we built the basic character, and then we built a kind of a little bit more advanced things after that. And then we talked about a few other things. So if you go to our Fantasy Grounds College YouTube channel and look for our Pathfinder 2 playlist, we did a little bit in there because there's not a lot of content out there. So there is stuff out there. You just have to know where to look. The other thing is, most of our stuff that we do is centered around 5th edition, but that's mainly because of the popularity of it. It isn't necessarily any bias, and then there's a lot more content and support for 5th edition. So that's why we mainly default to that, and a lot of it has to do with me. That's the rule set I know. I know a little bit about Pathfinder and Alien and Savage Worlds and stuff, but mostly my forte is the 5th edition rule set. So, all right, I think I yammered enough. Hopefully that helps you guys a little bit in deciding if you want to use Fantasy Grounds for your role-playing solution online. The other thing you're going to have to get used to is how do you communicate? Because there's a lot of different programs out there. Most people use Discord, but that may not work for you. So I did a little bit of a tutorial about Discord. I think I'll release it one of these days. I have to edit it. But anyhow, folks, take care. Have a good evening. I'm going to call it a night.